In metaphysics, my philosophy, objectivism, holds that there is only one reality, not two, nor four, nor 10.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reality. My name is William, and I'm here with Lev.
Hello, everyone.
Our topic today is the recent explosion in Beirut, and we'll be discussing all the aspects of that occurrence and also how to prevent urban disasters in the future. I want to discuss the history, briefly, the history of what happened in Beirut. In 2013, there was a cargo ship that brought a lot of ammonium nitrate into Beirut. There's some debate on why it stopped in Beirut. It either had a mechanical problem or it ran out of money to continue traveling through the Suez Canal. In any case, it got stranded in Beirut, and because the owner of the ship, or the person who was leasing it, Igor Grechushkin, he ran out of money and went bankrupt and abandoned the ship. So the Lebanese authorities impounded it and then took the ammonium nitrate off the ship and put it in a warehouse and let it sit there for 6 years. During that time, the threat of the ammonium nitrate just sitting in the warehouse was recognized by the port authorities, and they sent several warning letters to the judiciary in Lebanon, but they apparently just ignored it, and which ultimately led to the problem that caused the explosion. Do you have anything to add to that brief history, Lev?
Well, we have to remember that the explosion was absolutely huge, and it killed 165 people, last we saw mentioned, and thousands injured, and of course, huge amounts of property damage as a result. And there's some debate of what caused the fire, specifically that led to the explosion. There were fireworks stored nearby. There's other potential issues of storing ammonium nitrate that could lead to explosions and of this magnitude. Throughout the media, I've heard a lot about people trying to blame each other in Beirut about whose fault it is for the explosion, but a lot of our focus today in our discussion here is what kind of actions are appropriate anyway. We're not trying to find out who is at fault here or what caused it, but how do we deal with such risks and disasters in any civilized society?
Yeah, before we get into the details of the explosion, we should first discuss threats in general, like urban threats to a city in general, and get a basic understanding of what the broader issue is here and how to handle these situations. And then we can discuss what went wrong in Beirut. So the central question I think we want to start with is what constitutes a threat to a city or anybody in general?
Well, you could approach it in the sense that risk is up to us to manage, and just because something happens doesn't mean we have to be protected from it even. Like, we can think of threats as in imminent danger to your body and mind, or a threat could be something you'd rather not have happen to you. And so what we want to understand is like, is this a societal issue? Is it a government issue? How should it be dealt with? Like when there's explosions, people would often want to go to the government to seek an answer or have the government fix it or blame the government. So we're trying to see, well, who is the center of responsibility here? How do we deal with a disaster? Nobody wants a disaster to happen, and the rational thing to do would be to prevent or avoid them from happening. So we want to approach it more like, is it in our self-interest for the government to protect us from disasters like the Beirut explosion? Is that within the domain of something we should be protected from?
I believe it is, especially in a city situation where you have a government managing the protection of your rights. It would be a lot different in just some frontier where there's no organized government or police force. But in a city like Beirut, the people are congregated closely together and there's a higher risk of conflict and things happening. And that's why you have a government to manage all these societal issues, including threats to your safety. And in my view, a threat in that situation is something that potentially could cause you harm. That's kind of my general view of it. And you would have to have a reasonable expectation that given the current situation, something bad is likely to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you think that's a matter of rights still, though? Because, I mean, I would agree, of course, that there's things that are dangerous you should deal with, but a lot of the time that could be dealt with privately. Like if I see a risk of flooding that will cause property damage, it'd be in my interest to find some way to dam it up or something like that. And failing to do so isn't hurting anyone but myself, probably. It could hurt people downstream, but that's a threat that is posed there, but that's not necessarily something the government needs to deal with.
Yeah, so there would be degrees or levels of threats. So there would be threats to your person, threats to your neighborhood, or threats to the whole city. So the personal level, you'd have to take personal responsibility for anyone shooting a gun at you on the street or something like that, or lightning striking you in the wilderness. And then maybe at a city level, you would have to go to the governing authorities to handle a citywide threat, such as a bunch of fertilizer being stored in a warehouse at the port. And like, unfortunately, in this situation, I think partly it was the judiciary that failed the people. The threats were reported by the port authorities, but the judiciary didn't do anything, and the material just stayed in the warehouse for years.
My concern is that I'm not really sensing much of a principle behind what you're saying, other than it's just risk management. I mean, risk management itself isn't rights protection. I mean, if we think about the government as risk management, there isn't any in principle reason they can't manage risk of any kind, whether it's like even managing the risk of even how media reports information. If they want to manage risk, you could almost argue that it's proper to regulate that. So I would rather think of it in terms of, given an object in particular, is its non-management, is that equivalent to somebody initiating force? If the ammonium nitrate is stored in an improper way, would that be equivalent to initiation of force? It's just a matter of time before it goes off rather than if it could go off.
I'm not sure it's equivalent to the initiation of force. It's the threat. It's an objective. Well, it's an objective potential of force.
Or imminent initiation, I would
Yeah.
say.
It's maybe the difference is when we think of initiation of force, we think of some human deciding to initiate an assault on you or defraud you or something. But in this case, it would be an accident. So it's not really the initiation, it's just a threat of harm to you. So I think the moral principles involved here are self-defense and the right to your safety, the right to your own life. And you have to decide what is an unacceptable risk to your safety, to your own life. And that would require analyzing each scenario in detail and relating it to your principle. I think in this case, in the Beirut situation, we had a historical precedent that this was a threat. These explosions, ammonium nitrate explosions, have occurred before in China and in 2015 and in Texas City in 1947. Almost exact scenarios happened where huge quantities of ammonium nitrate were brought to a port and they exploded. So there's not only is there a historical precedent for this being a threat, but there's also the rational evaluation of the situation. Obviously, this explosive material sitting in one warehouse within a city is the danger, and you need to take precautions.
What you're saying makes me think of a worthwhile distinction. We can think of threats in terms of actions or we can think of threats in terms of classes of objects. For instance, you could say a gun is a threat, or you could say the use of the gun is a threat. We might want to distinguish between, are we saying actions are threats, or are we saying certain types of objects pose threats? It's a subtle difference, I think, but I think it helps to understand what sort of behavior we want to regulate or control. Certainly we want to control initiation of force and the threat of force, but should we think about threats in terms of actions or objects?
There's also the location and the whole context. It's hard to narrow it down to just an action or an object because it's the whole situation. It's putting the fertilizer. It's the fertilizer is the object, but it's the putting it in the warehouse in the city, the action, which also contributes to the threat. So
I disagree. I would rather say that think of it in terms of the essential cause, and the essential cause is the object. Without that, there is nothing. And with other factors like a flame, it's not necessarily going to cause an explosion. It's the mixture with the ammonium nitrate that would cause the explosion. So if we're thinking in terms of how to protect from this, in terms of the government, I think it's important to distinguish the action from the object. Because the action of just storing ammonium nitrate is not itself a threat. It's only a threat in the manner in which a threat by the nature of the object.
it's true that without the ammonium nitrate, there wouldn't be the threat of it exploding. But I think there's more to the threat. So if they were to take the ammonium nitrate and just stick it in a warehouse in the desert where no one lived around there, then it wouldn't be a threat to the city. So it's a relational problem, or the threat is relational. It's the object related to the city.
Mm-hmm.
So without the city, you can also consider the city an object with all of its contents. And then the fertilizer is part of the city now.
True.
So it's kind of like a gun itself is not a threat to anything unless you stick it in the hands of a murderer. And then the murderer with the gun is a threat. But the fertilizer itself wouldn't be a threat to anything unless you stick it in the middle of a city.
Yeah, my issue with that is might be too too generalized, because then that leaves room either for having absolutely no control of any, well, in principle, no justification for the government to control any object, or it gives justification for the government to control every object. And I'm not sure I don't think that's the way of thinking we would want to go with. We're not trying to find some perfect way of living for every risk or determining for people what risk they ought to take or ought not to take. Right? That's why I'm talking about the object itself. Because I want to talk about, well, what's the essential of the object we're talking about? What's the main thing about the object that we're concerned with? What's the essential consideration?
So are you trying to say that it's because it's explosive?
Yeah, or maybe say one class of object would be weapon, which is in principle extremely different than, of course, like owning a knife or owning a plunger. I mean, you could murder somebody with a plunger, but the purpose of a plunger has nothing to do with the weapon. It's to unclog your toilet. It would be insane, I think, to suggest that plungers should be regulated because they could be used as murder weapons. I mean, that's not why they're produced.
Yeah. It would be hard to classify the fertilizer as a weapon, though, because it has a mixed use, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the really tricky one, because in a way, fertilizer is explosives in a way. It's just, I'm not sure if that actually might be one of the fewer exceptions. Explosives seems really difficult to talk about because, I mean, there are valid non-weapon uses of explosives, but it would almost seem that the main purpose is destruction. So it would be fair to regulate those sort of goods because, well, maybe in the kind of what you're saying, the risk of those is so high that it poses imminent threat to you unless it's stored properly with proper regulation and all that.
I could see that. I mean, I think if you can classify something as an explosive, dangerous to humans, you would want to regulate it within whatever context you seem that's necessary for your situation. So if you're bringing in a lot of fertilizer into a port, how would you regulate that? Would you give them a certain time amount to would you even let it in the port in that mass quantity in that group, or would you require them to offload it in segments and then get it out of the port before they bring on more? I don't know how you'd go about ensuring the safety of the city.
I think the only proper response at the municipal level would be to deny entry. And I mean, I don't know if there's any other solution besides that. The issue in this case with denying them entry is that essentially the boat was going to be abandoned or left alone because the original leaser of the boat didn't want to take care of it anymore. He wanted to let it go. And it could be taken over by pirates or terrorists or who knows. And that quantity of explosives in their hands would be probably worse than what we even saw in Beirut. That would be one concern you have for this context specifically.
So if we deny entry, do you mean not allow the ship into the port, or not allow them to offload the fertilizer?
Not even let them in the port until inspection.
Uh,
But
well, I think they probably inspected it. Don't
yeah, I
they?
mean, I would hope so. I mean, I guess that would be allowed. Then the next step would be assuring its proper storage. Because if you're granting the government the right and authority to um, demand inspection upon entry, then I think you're also granting them or requiring the government to provide for the proper storage of that explosives. Because if you're going to protect people or if you're going to deal with this threat, they have to neutralize it in some way, which in this case would be proper storage, proper standards, and then that would be okay. A lot of the issue in Beirut was that it wasn't maintained properly, and many people avoided responsibility, government and private.
If we move past the issue of whether to let them in the port, I think it's up to the port to be equipped to store such material. I think if you're going to allow this material into your port, you need to be ready to store it. And I think that was one of the problems with Beirut is they didn't have things like underground storage facilities lined with concrete or many different buildings where they could separate the material into smaller chunks so it wasn't as dangerous. In general, they just weren't ready to store this material, and that fault lies at the hands of the government, since the government was running the port.
I'm starting to think that it's better to clarify why these sort of things must be regulated beyond just simply being a threat or judging it as a weapon. It's more like there's at some point when something becomes a weapon, becomes a risk, it's when it can go off and harm somebody and it is preventable based on any proper principle of storage. And it is proper for government to regulate these things because the nature of these things is to harm or inflict destruction. And you want to deal with things that we want to figure out ways to deal with things on the fringe, like something's explosive or fertilizer. That's something that's worth discussion. It's not like keeping a nuclear bomb in your backyard. The main issue here is what is a weapon and when does it become a threat?
It's hard for me to use the word weapon because when I think of weapon, I think of something made for the purpose of hurting other people. And I'm not sure that we should limit the threat to weapons. I think the threat can be larger than it can be anything that poses a danger, especially in a city situation where there's something like a mass quantity of fertilizer being stored that is historically shown to be a threat. I don't think you can avoid that. I mean, that's a fact, historical fact, that something needs to be done, or else a huge explosion could happen and half the city is destroyed. So I don't think you can allow such a risk, even if you don't consider it a weapon. Like it doesn't matter if you consider it a weapon or not. It's still a threat. Pretty much anything can be used as a weapon, right? You could use a tree as a weapon.
Yeah.
If suddenly people started taking DVD players and smashing them over people's heads and that became the new trend, then you'd have to do something about DVD players. You'd have to at least address the issue and say, all right, you got to show some. No, we can't let felons buy DVD players anymore. If it became a big trend or something, or
I don't think that would change anything. Those things are still not manufactured for that purpose. I think conceptually speaking, that's not what's happening. I understand that the object in reality can be used in any particular way, but I think the definitions and concepts we use to think about these things, we can use as evidence for whether we can regulate or should regulate any objects. There's many things that can be considered a threat, and we've agreed on that so far. I'm just not sure when the threshold between a threat you deal with on your own or a threat that must be dealt with on a municipal level. You could say that cutting down trees is a threat in the sense that it'll damage your property over time, but I'm not sure if that would even meet the threshold of, oh, government should regulate how much trees you cut down in efforts of preventing property damage, which then could somehow way down the line cause medical distress for you in some way or another. That seems like so distant. The causality is so pulled apart there that I'm not sure we can consider those things a threat anymore. Or at least it diminishes what we think of as threats.
yeah, there's a certain degree of likelihood, I think is the best way to say it, that you need to assess. So, like, how many factors are required for that object to be used as a weapon? Like, how likely is it for someone to use a DVD player to smash over your head?
Well, do we need likelihoods? Because if we define a concept by its essential, we could define any object by its essential. And we don't need to worry about what's the likelihood of violating that essential or being used in some other way besides the essential. I don't think this is what we want to think in terms of. We just go on probability. It can change any day, any time, any year. If we think of an essential, it stays the same as long as the definition stays the same, or until some new scientific discovery. But until then, the essential tells you what it'll be used for, regardless of what people feel or think or would like to use it for. The essential will always remain.
People can use objects for anything they can imagine. So it's hard to say there's an essential use for an object. You can say what it was originally intended to be used for, and then there's uses that people discover in the future. So anything, some guy can imagine a new use for a deck of cards, and then suddenly that might become the new use.
Well, in that sense, sure, I can agree with you. If there's some new discovery that will change what you understand, sure, it's not just a matter of like, oh, he's using playing cards either to write notes on or to play cards. Or it's not something like somebody bought a gun and they use it as a walking stick. Those aren't like discoveries, or just like minor alterations for other common uses. And it'd be kind of insane for somebody to claim that they bought a gun to use as a walking stick. Like, say, oh, this shotgun is just a walking stick. Like, no, it's still a weapon that you use to kill people. It doesn't matter. You use it for that stupid reason, and we could regulate it because we know it's a weapon and it's used to harm people. And if you choose not to use it that way, that's your choice, but doesn't change what it is.
Yeah, so my point is that any government needs to look at the uses of objects that are in current society and determine if they're a threat. And the nature of an object as a threat could change over time. And so this would have to be a constant process that the government goes through. And it wouldn't just be the nature of the object. It would be the nature of the object being used by people in that society. So, because the principle here is self-defense. So the government needs to protect the people from being harmed. And the people can be harmed in any various different ways. So if suddenly pencils became the major weapon of a city, and the government found some truck coming into the city loaded with pencils, well, that would be a sign that that truck might be a threat, because that's the new weapon.
I wouldn't think so. I mean, that wouldn't change the fact that pencils are writing utensils. They aren't weapons. They can be weaponized, but they're not weapons. And I don't think anyone could argue otherwise. I don't think we want.
If it's weaponized, it's a weapon.
Well, I wouldn't say that's the same thing. I wouldn't classify the object as a weapon.
Well, a weapon is a tool that can used to harm people, right?
And pencils aren't. I mean, you could do it for other things. I'm not saying it couldn't be used for other things. I'm saying that's not part of what we understand the object as a concept to be. I would rather have the government try to determine regulations if were applicable in terms of how concept formation usually works. We're not going to start wondering about all the different ways a table could be used to define table. Like, I'm not going to say it's not furniture because I could use it as a weapon, or I'm not going to say it's a weapon and furniture at the same time. There's only one essential about it. You have to figure out what it is. And if it's not a weapon, then there's no reason to regulate it. That's what I'm thinking. And of course, things could change over time, like concepts do, and that would be perfectly appropriate to change the rules later. But I don't think it'd be appropriate to argue only in terms of probability, which isn't how concept formation really works. You don't determine that like 80% tables are used as furniture, therefore the essential is furniture. Or it's not like 80% of tables are used as weapons, therefore it's a weapon. That doesn't work that way.
I think I see the issue here is with the definition of weapon. Weapon is not a specific class of objects. It's an open class of objects. It's can be anything. It's not necessarily a gun. It's not necessarily a knife. It's anything used to harm people. So you can pick up a rock and use it as a weapon. You see what I'm saying? It's not. There's not a specific group of objects that we say, all right, only these things can be weapons.
I kind of agree. The difference between can be a weapon versus how you define it, what the essential is. I mean, rocks are more ambiguous than either pencils or tables or even guns. It's much more ambiguous, I think, and more difficult to determine. I mean, any concept is an open class of things. And there's always infinite potential to add more or take away.
Not everything can be used as a lamp, right?
True.
And I guess not everything can be used as a weapon, but I think the point is that it's much broader than man-made objects intended to shoot people or intended to harm people. It's when we think of weapon, we think of like an object, just an object that is used to harm people.
Well,
and
maybe I'll
say a gun is a weapon. that shoots bullets.
Yeah, I still mostly agree with you. I just think you're going a little overbroad, but it's making me wonder, do you agree though that weapons, insofar as something is a weapon, it can and should be regulated?
Depends on the nature of the weapon. Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree that certain weapons should be regulated, especially ones that can be used for mass killing. I'm kind of on the side of regulating machine guns. I think that was probably proper. I think a machine gun is a weapon of war. Probably shouldn't be allowed. If you can own one, it should be heavily regulated. You can't be a felon. You can't have any violence in your past, something like that. So I do agree that obviously big weapons like bombs need to be regulated. I mean, that has the potential for destroying a whole city or neighborhood. You can't just let anyone have that. So there needs to be some regulation of weapons, but for like small handguns or something like that, individuals need to be able to protect themselves at a personal level at least. So I think anyone except the worst felons should be able to own like a handgun. Whether they should be allowed to conceal it or not is a different matter. So, but we can get into that maybe on a show devoted to regulating weapons.
I think as far as ammonium nitrate, I think it easily falls into that class of regulatable and potential for mass destruction.
Yeah.
I mean, quite obviously, we've seen what it does. I mean, it decimates an entire port, and I think it's easy to see how that constitutes a threat. Just even existing in that state, it's like in an unstable state, and being in an unstable state made it a threat. Because if it were properly stored, it couldn't even pose a threat anymore. It'd be neutral.
Yeah, I was discussing degrees of the likelihood of an accident before, and I think that the likelihood of that fertilizer detonating was extreme because there was literally like one factor that was needed to set it off, which was the fire. If a fire in a building can cause the destruction of a city, something's wrong and you need to address it immediately. That's just a one factor away from disaster. And a fire can be caused by so many different things. In this case, I guess it was a welding accident. But on top of all that, they stored some fireworks in that warehouse. So they just made it an even worse situation. I think it was an extreme failure at every level. And it just shows why you don't want to live in a country like Lebanon.
Yeah, or so many more other issues besides even this one thing. It's probably a sign of much more broader systemic issues within Lebanon beyond just a single city.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to leave our thoughts for now. There's so much more to say about weapons and threats, I think, but I think it's good to put international events in the context of principles of rights and defense and self-defense.
It's a real shame that it takes a disaster like this for us to discuss these issues of self-defense and rights and prevention. Yeah. But I think that was a great discussion. I look forward to the next one.
Yeah, me too. Bye, everyone.
Thank you for watching this episode of Welcome to Reality. Please join us next time for another discussion where we apply philosophical ideas to moral and political action. To support the show, please share our content and consider becoming a sponsor. You'll find a link to our Patreon page in the description of this video.